I'm filming the exercises. They're a little bit picky, but for this first set, we're trying to integrate our strength through our wrists, through the flexors, the extensors, and also the intrinsic. So I'm going to be cueing some finger action. So the first one, because you can't see my hands very well here, is when I place the hands down, I want to put pressure through the ends of the fingertips and also through the edge of the pinky side and thumb side. So there'll be a little bit of a cupping in here, and so that's just getting the muscles firing in the hands, and that takes pressure off the wrist, which is helpful when we're getting our range back. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. And you may not be able to see my hands that well, but I do want to line up my wrists with my elbows and my shoulders and trying to stay really strong through those areas that I mentioned. So that's going to activate the arm muscles, and that's going to keep me from sinking into my shoulders or my wrists. And so we're just going to start with a bit of a shift. And if that feels good, we can come into kind of circular rotation. So we're challenging the range of motion as we do that and trying to stay at that soft edge where we're not feeling too much compression and tension. Good, and then we can take 5 tricep presses. So still staying really connected in through the fingers, and we're not collapsing into the shoulders here. We're staying broad through the collarbones, but really keeping arms by our sides to press through the triceps. So this is actually really functional because when we get up from a surface, whether it's the floor or a chair or somewhere, especially if we're holding on to a baby in the other arm, this is going to just give us that strength through the tricep so that we're not pushing in through the wrist and maybe injuring or irritating those structures that are still stiff. And doing about 3 or 5 in between, and then coming back to our shifts or our circles. And then we did some spinal mobility, and this is where we're integrating the spinal mobility with the strength through the wrists and the arms. So it's easy enough again to collapse into the wrists and the shoulders as we do this, but instead you're going to start to really feel those muscles firing up through the forearms as you maintain that connection on extension of T-spine and flexion of T-spine and coming out there. So you can do repetitions of this ×4, take a break in between, stretch out through the wrists in between in the other direction, and proceed from there. And then the next part includes the dumbbell exercises. So we talked a lot about, some of the things that can go a little bit wrong when we're starting to work into what we call this open chain, because it's a little more dynamic and we don't have a lot of control in the same way we have with the TheraBand. So you can continue using your TheraBand, but if you do get a 5-pound weight, then there's a few ways that you can do this in a way that's supported and not causing a lot of tension up here and really getting your maximum range and strength. So for purposes of filming, I apologize for the film quality, I'm going to find a surface that's going to work for me where I can support and rest my arm. I want to really isolate those muscles at first, because sometimes our brain wants to just move everything. So typically if we've had a wrist injury and I ask you to supinate and pronate, you can see I can do that kind of mostly with my wrist, and I can think about doing that with my forearm. And there's going to be some movement with my shoulder, but if you try to move your wrist and find that you're dumping with your shoulder, that's something where we just need to work on isolating movement. Arm's pretty complicated and dynamic, but easy enough if we break it down. So starting with a bit of a neutral rest, and you're coming down into as much extension as you can, and then up into full flexion. So if you get the 5-pound weight, I would start with just sets of 5, 3 sets of 5 with breaks in between. See how that feels, and progress to 3 sets of 10 on a daily basis. You always want to increase your challenge without feeling like there's an irritation in the wrist an hour after your exercise. So right now it's wrist extension and flexion through full range. It's really easy enough to we get here and it's tight and it's weak and we want to stop. So that's the most important thing for you to do, is to try not to stop the whole way. You can continue with the other exercises that you're doing. So with the biceps, what I recommend is that you start with the bigger muscles, because by the time you get to the exercises where you're just isolating through the wrist, you're going to be a little fatigued there already. So I'd rather you not fatigue your wrist and then end up, hurting it when you're going through these movements. But it's also a great idea to do them just when you start off, just to do them completely separate to your other exercises, so you can really focus in on them. The last thing that we talked about that I'm going to reinforce here is how you can mobilize your wrist into more flexion. So I found that for illustration purposes, you had just a little bit, if this is your left side, you had just a little bit less. So if you keep your arms together and you come down, you were a little bit like this. So we wanted to get a little bit more, which you felt that tightness and tension along here. Part of that's wrist stiffness, and so for the wrist stiffness purposes, I wanted you to mobilize your wrist in that direction with just straight pressure. So I put my wrist on this surface of a bed, and try to keep my shoulders from getting all tight and uncomfortable. And I press into here and then come into that wrist flexion stretch. Then that's just going to reinforce that mobility, and we did see a little bit of a change. So that's the last one. All right, I hope this was helpful.